Welcome to See Crime Stories, true stories of the missing and the pursuit of answers. In West Valley City, Utah, the weekend looked ordinary until it wasn't. By dawn on Monday, a 28-year-old mother named Susan Cox Powell was gone. Inside her home, two box fans hummed at a damp patch on the living room couch. Her wallet and ID were still there. No 911 call. No note. No trace of voluntary departure. In cases like this, investigators start with one rule: if there's no body, the scene you can prove becomes the body of the story. Sunday, December 6, 2009, began with routine, church, a normal afternoon, a neighbor's visit that ended before evening settled in. Nothing in those hours suggested imminent danger. What stopped people short was the next morning's silence. Daycare reported no drop-off. Calls went unanswered. A welfare check put officers at the door. They found a lived-in room presented as if something had been managed, not cleaned, fans positioned toward moisture on fabric, personal effects left behind, a cell phone that would later turn up in the family minivan. It wasn't chaos. It was a quiet room that raised questions. The first pass in an evidence-forward investigation is to lock the clock. Who saw the missing person last, and when? In this case, the home is the last confirmed location. That designation matters. It directs forensic attention to absorbent materials, transfer surfaces, and any sign the environment was altered in a narrow window. Technicians document the wet area, its size and placement, and the airflow path from the fans. They collect swabs from hard surfaces near the couch, note temperature and humidity, and take photos before anything is moved. Small details, like whether cushions were flipped or whether cleaner residue fluoresces, can change the weight of later conclusions. The second pass is to stabilize the inner circle timeline. That means reconstructing the hours between late Sunday and early Monday with phone pings, device activity, vehicle location data, and witness statements. It also means asking a blunt question: if a healthy adult leaves without her wallet, identification, and obligations, is that a choice or an interruption? Investigators avoid the trap of narrative. They test each point. Was there a medical call? A rideshare record? A neighbor's camera picking up movement at an odd hour? A door sensor chirp? If those entries aren't there, the space between last seen and first noticed missing grows narrow enough to study minute by minute. The third pass is to decide how much the room is telling you. A damp couch can be spill, cleanup, or staging. Fans can be ordinary, people dry carpets every day, or they can be a signal that time on fabric matters. In missing person cases that later become homicides, ordinary objects often become the map. The data aligned too cleanly on Monday morning: a mother absent without her essentials, a house that looked recently adjusted, and no credible sign she left on her own. Sometimes that is the problem: the neatness is a clue. For audiences who follow cold cases, the pattern here is familiar but never routine: a last seen location with anomalies, no reported alarm at the moment of disappearance, and immediate reliance on forensics rather than eyewitnesses. The work from this point forward is procedural: document, preserve, verify. The tone is not dramatic, it's disciplined. That discipline is what gives families straight answers years later, if those answers can be found. The story moves to the hours most people sleep. The explanation on the table is simple to say and hard to accept: a spontaneous, after-midnight camping run with two small children during a winter storm, while the mother stayed home. In real investigations, claims like that aren't argued first, they're tested. You measure them against time, weather, roads, fuel, and what the phones and the car can tell you. If the story holds, the data will carry it. If it breaks, it usually breaks at the edges, minute marks, gaps, and missed common sense. Detectives start by locking the window from late Sunday to early Monday. The daycare call that morning establishes the first alarm. The welfare check fixes the scene as the last confirmed location. Now comes the alibi test. Investigators request weather logs, roadway reports, and any plow activity for the corridor described. They check store hours along that route for a quick supply stop, because most parents who actually camp with toddlers grab something, fuel, snacks, or a blanket. If there is no transaction, the next question is mileage. How far could the family vehicle go between the last known fill and the time officers later seize it? Odometer readings, trip meters, and service stickers give a range. Even a small mismatch between stated destinations and possible range is useful. It doesn't prove a crime, but it narrows the search. The next pass is digital. Phones are clocks with maps attached. If a device stayed home, that's one kind of signal. If it moved, you look for towers and pings consistent with a night drive. Some families had early GPS units in 2009, most did not, but many carriers still retain call and text metadata that anchors a route even if the content is thin. Investigators also look at the car itself. Modern minivans store little traces, door open events, radio presets last used, even seatbelt clicks if the module is advanced enough. None of that by itself is a headline. Together, it either sketches a drive or leaves a blank page. Children's statements are handled with care and recorded under supervision. The older child's account confirms a night drive but adds a conflict about whether mom went and came back. That kind of conflict isn't a verdict, it's a direction. It tells detectives where to look for corroboration. Did any neighbor see the vehicle leave at the stated hour? Did a motion light trigger? Did a late-night camera on a nearby home capture headlights at a time that fits, or doesn't? When a story is true, it survives these small tests. When it is not, the minute hand becomes the detective's best witness. Investigators map the plausible camping sites within the claimed radius, then compare difficulty of access and expected preparation for weather. Taking toddlers to a frozen turnout is not just unusual, it demands gear. Where's the gear? Is it packed in a way that suggests recent use, or is it staged, clean, folded, and wrong for the night described? That audit is quick and unemotional. You list items, sleeping bags, pads, portable stove, a tent that can handle snow load. If something is missing, either it was used and not returned, or it was never used at all. In missing person work, these small domestic gaps become more reliable than memory. The human side isn't ignored, it's documented. Friends and congregation members outline what Sunday looked like, normal activities, no talk of a sudden trip, no notes about a plan to be out of contact. That lack of preparation doesn't prove the alibi false, but it pushes the analysis back to hard data. Investigators request a simple matrix, claimed timeline versus documented timeline. Departure time, route, stop, destination, return. If even one column is empty, no camera, no receipt, no tower in the right sector, the narrative sags. The data align too cleanly inside the house, outside, it starts to look thin. Search planning follows the alibi's geography. If a night drive happened, where could it lead? In this case, Utah's West Desert rises in the briefings. Open land, long sight lines by day, but nowhere near as forgiving at night. Old mine workings dot the maps. Detectives have seen that pattern before, wide spaces that hide small things. They call in teams who know the terrain and ask for historic maps of shafts and adits, knowing that an early winter and limited daylight compress search windows. It's not a conclusion, it's a deployment choice. You follow the story that can be checked, and you reserve judgment until the checks are over. Cases like this are not solved by speeches. They move forward because each ordinary detail, fuel, weather, receipts, seat positions either lines up or it doesn't. In towns across the West, missing person investigations remind people that safety is often ordinary, too, a parent who plans, a neighbor who notices, a teacher who calls when a child doesn't arrive. When those ordinary behaviors stop, investigators tighten the focus. The alibi is not condemned here. It is weighed. By the end of this phase, the working picture is simple: a claimed midnight outing under poor conditions, limited support and records, and a home that reads like the last confirmed location. The next step is to treat that living room as a timeline in fabric and tile, because if the road doesn't tell the story, the room might. The front door opens to a room that is now the last confirmed place Susan Cox Powell was known to be alive. Investigators work that fact like a mandate. They start with documentation, not theory, full scene photographs, measurements, and a walkthrough that records what is present and what is conspicuously absent. The thermostat setting, window positions, and the way furniture faces each other all go into the notes. This isn't decoration, it's a baseline. If anything changes later, the baseline tells you who changed it and when. Technicians move to preservation. Soft surfaces are the priority because they hold traces the eye won't catch. The cushions, the armrest fabric, and the carpet edge closest to the couch are swabbed with sterile technique. A moisture meter checks how deep the dampness runs into the cushion foam. If it is only on the surface, you're likely dealing with a recent spill or wipe. If it penetrates, you're looking at something applied with time to soak. The team labels and seals each sample, logs the time, and photographs the label next to the item to fix chain of custody. They do the same with nearby hard surfaces, the tile line by the couch, baseboards, and the coffee table corners that might transfer skin cells or tiny fluid spots during a hurried cleanup. Small findings matter because there is no body. In cases like this, trace evidence is how you prove people did, or did not, do what they claim. Lab work begins the moment those seals are signed in. Presumptive tests screen for blood, followed by confirmatory analysis if the screen is positive. The quantity here is not the headline, it rarely is in a missing person scene. What matters is identity and context. If a small sample matches the missing adult, that does not prove death, it establishes that an event involving her blood occurred in the room where she was last known to be. Analysts will then ask whether the pattern, size, and location fit a benign explanation or point to force. A single spot on tile can be explained away. A spot with cleaning residue around it begs a different question: why was it wiped, and why there? The report describes the chemistry, not motives. That separation keeps the narrative honest. While the lab processes swabs, the field team audits ordinary appliances that explain airflow and dry time. Fans positioned toward a damp area are recorded for angle and distance. If a cushion is flipped, the zip scene gets a photograph. If a slipcover is misaligned, that's noted too. The reason is time. Drying is predictable under known conditions. A fan on high at a set distance will evaporate moisture at a measurable rate. If neighbors last saw the family at a certain hour and the living room still shows recent dampness, it tightens the window for when the dampness was created. That is not drama, it's how you turn an empty room into a timeline. Detectives also look for the small overlaps that link a room to a person. A hair in a seam that can be mitochondrial tested if needed. Skin cells on a throw blanket that, combined with other points, might support or undercut a claim about who used the couch and when. The goal is not to flood a lab with every fiber in sight. It is to pick samples that answer specific questions. Was there an event implicating the missing person here, and did someone take steps to reduce what that event left behind? Where the sampling stops, interviews start. Statements about the last evening's activities are taken, then compared against what the room can sustain. A claim that cleaning happened days earlier is tested by whether the chemistry on fabric is consistent with fresh cleaner or aged residue. The room does not convict anyone. It does eliminate bad timelines. There is also the human reality of a space like this. It is a family room where two little boys watched television and played with toys. Detectives treat it with the same respect they'd want for their own homes. They move items only when necessary, return what they can, and leave a record of anything taken. Families deserve accuracy more than they deserve speed. In towns across the country, people who watch true crime want the truth, not the performance. The work here is slow because the answers need to stand up 15 years later. If this investigation reaches a courtroom someday, these early choices will be the foundation. By the time the living room is released back to the family, the evidence picture is modest but meaningful: a confined area that reads as recently altered, trace results that place the missing adult at the space in a way that raises concern, and no physical sign she walked away with essentials. That doesn't close a case. It sets a direction. With the room documented and samples in the pipeline, the search plan shifts outward, to vehicles, to possible routes, and to the open desert investigators already have on their maps. When a home speaks softly, the next answers are rarely inside four walls. The next answers weren't in fabric, they were in steel and on the map. Detectives served the paperwork, took the family minivan into evidence, and treated it the same way they treated the living room, no assumptions, only measurements and a timeline. Exterior first, photographs from every angle to capture road splash, wheel wells, tire condition, and anything lodged along the undercarriage. Interior next, seats photographed as found, child restraints documented, floor mats lifted and bagged. A quick walk around with fresh gloves confirmed what mattered most for the next phase. If a night drive happened, this vehicle should help confirm where and when. They started with the basics that hold up in court: odometer reading at intake, fuel level, and any recent service stickers. Investigators compared those numbers to the claimed route and the plausible mileage range for a winter round trip in Utah. Then they traced the path that a parent hauling toddlers would likely take: main arteries, not back roads, gas stations that stay open past midnight, any grocery or convenience store that could sell a blanket or hot drink. If a stop happened, there should be receipts, security cameras, or at least motion detections outside a storefront at the right time. When nothing obvious surfaced, the work pivoted to microsignals inside the van. Seat rails can tell you more than a story can. Photos record each driver's seat notches found. A tall driver versus a shorter one leaves a different position. The rear cabin shows whether a second row seat was moved to load bulk gear or remained fixed for everyday use. Investigators noted the child seats were properly latched, the buckles as found, and the belts not twisted. Facts that sound minor until you realize they can show whether someone strapped children in at an unusual hour or left them as they were after a routine day. On the floor, debris is geography in miniature. Utah winters put a crust of sand and salt on boots. Desert pullouts leave talc-fine dust. Technicians lifted what they could without tearing up the carpets and bagged it for later comparison if a search area was identified. Time was the constant. The daycare's Monday morning alert gave a hard start for the missing person clock. The house fixed the last seen location. The van had to bridge those points or leave them disconnected. Investigators pulled any onboard diagnostics that were available for that model year and checked the most reliable modern witnesses, the phones. If a device connected to the car's power port overnight, the charge pattern could put the van in use. If a phone stayed behind, it argued against an extended family outing. Call metadata, rings, failed calls, or texts that never left the network helped narrow a commute-length drive from a longer trip into open country. The next layer was practical parenting. Camping with toddlers after midnight in a storm is a claim that leaves logistical tracks. A tote with blankets, a thermos, a bin with snacks, those things are either in the van or they aren't. If they are, they usually show fresh use: a damp corner, a wrapper, a misplaced cap with condensation. If they aren't, you look for a second vehicle or a stop that never appears on camera. It wasn't judgment, it was inventory. Families who truly pack out in bad weather usually leave a mess. This one didn't read that way. Once the intake was done, detectives handed the route question to a small team with a simple brief: trace what can be traced, then prune what can't. They laid a transparent grid over the west side corridors, marked every 24-hour station, and called managers for overnight video retention. Plow logs were pulled for key highways, not to show a license plate but to confirm whether certain stretches were even passable at the time claimed. A few locations near the Great Salt Lake had cameras that looked across lots and picked up headlights when they swept the entrance. The timestamps didn't support a clean there and back trip with children, and there wasn't a purchase pattern that fit a parent buying supplies for a cold stop. In towns like this, people understand the difference between a long shot and a lead. When the roads won't confirm a family campout, you stop treating the van like a prop and start treating it like a trailhead. The undercarriage findings, what little there was, pointed south and west rather than up into the Wasatch. That aligned with the working theory already on the board: open land, fewer cameras, and a night window narrow enough to matter. The team began prioritizing search zones that made sense for a short, purposeful drive, places with access after midnight, pullouts that don't draw attention, and terrain that swallows small evidence. The human piece stays in view even when you're staring at gas caps and seat rails. 2 boys rode in that van. A mother is missing. The job is to strip away noise and leave a map that can be searched with honesty, no theater, no shortcuts. When a story strains against the ordinary checks are all you can trust. Here, those checks pulled resources west. The next phase would leave asphalt and step into open country. Ground ops began with a clear brief. If a night drive happened, it was short, purposeful, and aimed at places with access after midnight. The map pushed south and west from West Valley City into open country where roads are dark, shoulders are wide, and pullouts don't draw attention. Teams built a first-day grid using highway turnouts, utility access lanes, and dirt spurs that can be reached quickly, then vanish a vehicle behind a bend. No dramatics, just a list of coordinates and a schedule tight enough to matter. Search leaders divided tasks by time and terrain. Roadside crews moved fast, 2 vehicles per sector, 1 logging, 1 scanning. Anything that looked freshly disturbed in early winter, pressed weeds, scraped gravel, tire scuff over frost, went into notes and photos. Farther out, slower teams took the spurs, walked drainage cuts, and marked culverts. Drones made sense only after sunup. At night they gave glare and little else. By day they could sweep the shoulders that feet couldn't cover before temperature dropped again. The working hypothesis wasn't new to anyone who has searched the Great Basin edge. Abandoned workings and prospect cuts are everywhere, some mapped, many not. You don't chase every hole, you prioritize what a driver could reach quickly, without lights giving the stop away. That meant old borrow pits, shallow trenches, and waste rock pads near the easier roads. Mines with gated collars were less useful. Adits with collapsed mouthings drew more attention, because they hide small evidence and swallow it again after a wind shift. What you need on days like this is patience and a plan for disappointment. The first sweeps turned up what first sweeps usually do, spent casings that predate the case by years, trash from pull-through campers, bottles wedged under sage. Crews treated everything like it could matter, then cut it loose only after they matched dates and brands that didn't fit 2009. The goal wasn't to find a narrative, the goal was to find anything that anchored a human event to a place, and the narrow window between the last time Susan was seen and the first time anyone realized she was missing. The vehicle debris collected earlier gave the team a chance to work smart. Technicians had bagged fine material from the minivan's floor and wells during intake. Now, geologists and evidence specialists compared that material to what the search lanes offered: roadside salt versus basin dust, granite fines versus volcanic tuff, the sort of quick-look triage you can do without burning lab time. No one expected a perfect match. They wanted a direction. If the undercarriage read more basin than foothill, you spend less energy on the Wasatch mouths and more on the westward fans where the ground turns powder dry when wind picks up. Managers also called for infrastructure data that gets ignored in casual searches. Utility turnarounds exist where trucks need room to pivot. They're built to be used at odd hours and often sit just off the main line with no camera sightline. Crews check those first because a stop there leaves little public trace. If a driver pulled into one, backed, and left again, the only sign might be a small smear of damp on packed soil. Early winter made that harder. The ground carried cold well, and the night gave little contrast. Teams compensated by revisiting the same points after the sun warmed the surface. It was a simple trick that sometimes turned new tread into readable prints. A few locations around Topaz Country moved higher on the board after day one. Not because anyone found a decisive item, but because the access logic made sense: good highways to get there, fast exits to get away, and enough small cuts to hide a stop without leaving a campfire or a neighbor to remember. When volunteers asked how to help, coordinators gave them 2 options that kept the search organized and safe: canvas fixed points, gas stations, 24-hour counters, and truck stops along the corridors for any overlooked footage or recollection, and walk-assigned legal public land with instructions on what not to touch and exactly how to mark a find. Public participation mattered for reasons beyond manpower. In cases that hover between missing person and presumed homicide, people need a place to put their care. Done right, it adds eyes without adding noise. Families are spared rumors, investigators are spared wild tips. The guidance was consistent. If you see clothing or a personal effect, mark and call. If you see human remains, step back and protect the scene. If you find nothing, that is still a reportable result. The point wasn't to make the audience part of the show. It was to give the case durable attention, the kind that survives when headlines move on. By the end of the first search cycle, the operation had what any honest report has: maps covered in pencil, a list of sectors cleared at a defensible standard, and a smaller list that deserved a second pass. Nothing linked Susan to the ground, and that was both expected and hard to hear. You don't call a desert search a failure because it didn't answer in a day. You call it groundwork, the part that keeps later leads from wasting time on places you already looked. The route logic held. West made more sense than up. Short, hidden stops beat long, scenic ones. Utility points and unmarked cuts earned repeat visits. Evidence from the house and van still set the clock. The mine question would stay alive as long as the case stayed open, but it wasn't the only explanation on the table, just the one that matched the night, the time window, and a vehicle that didn't pick up the signs of a family trip. For a channel like this, there's a simple promise we owe families: tell what's known, don't decorate the rest, and keep the lens on the places that matter. People don't need speeches to care, they need a path to follow. When a person vanishes, the accounts they leave behind keep talking. Investigators pulled routine financial records and found a pattern that didn't look like routine at all. Within days of the disappearance, key obligations that usually anchor a young family, childcare, standing appointments, were changed or canceled. At the same time, there were movements around money that flagged attention in any missing person case, especially one trending toward a nobody investigation. None of this is a verdict. It is a picture of priorities in the narrow window that matters. Detectives requested employer data, insurance paperwork, and retirement account logs. Those requests are all timestamped, and that is the point. If the stated focus is on a spouse who simply left to clear her head, the paperwork should reflect frantic searching and preservation of assets. What they saw instead suggested planning that didn't line up with hope she'd walk through the door. It takes initiative to move funds, to change beneficiaries, to close or reconfigure accounts. Those steps matter because they are deliberate. They tell you what someone thought the near future was going to be. Childcare decisions sharpened the picture. Daycare withdrawals or abrupt schedule changes in the first week after a disappearance are not inherently suspicious. Families adjust when crisis hits, but taken with financial repositioning, they add pressure to the timeline already fixed by the house and the vehicle. In a stable home, routines return unless a parent believes they won't. The file reflected the opposite: pulled schedules, fewer outside eyes, and less of the ordinary paper trail that comes from a parent trying to keep life normal for two small boys. Phones and mileage filled the next page. Investigators had already mapped the alleged night drive and found thin support. Now they looked at what came after: short trips that didn't match stated tasks, longer legs that raised the question every detective asks when the first search grid clears: why that direction, on that day, for that long? You don't need a dramatic story to make that relevant. You need the odometer, the gas records, and the calendar. One entry alone is noise. Together, entries form a pattern, and patterns are what cold cases survive on. The practical side of the file told its own story. Neighbors saw fewer comings and goings related to regular childcare routines. Friends who would normally be asked to help print flyers or coordinate calls were not used as much as you'd expect. Financial institutions that normally hear from both spouses began hearing from one. These are small observations, each of them explainable. But when you place them against a missing person clock that began on December 6, 2009, they pull the investigation away from a voluntary absence scenario and toward one that demands a wider search and closer scrutiny of motive. Investigators documented every action, because a case without a body has to be built with facts that don't fade. The entries were simple and unemotional: date, time, initiating party, type of transaction, and what changed. The same discipline applied to travel notes, date, miles, destination if known, and any corroboration. An investigator wrote a line in a margin that was later echoed in briefings. The data aligned too cleanly when it helped the story and went missing when it should have left a trace. Sometimes that is the problem. There's a human cost underneath this paperwork. 2 young children needed stability that December. A community wanted to believe the best. Families in cases like this often live in a split reality, holding on to hope while absorbing facts that point the other way. Our job, telling the story and keeping it clear, is to respect that split while laying out what the file actually shows. Money moved. Routine shrank. Travel didn't track cleanly. In a nobody case, those are not footnotes. They are the spine. The outcome of this phase was not an arrest or a courtroom. It was a sharpened hypothesis that guided what came next, the unsealing of documents and a deeper look at writings that recorded fear before the disappearance. Those releases did not close the case, but they did change how it was understood, inside the department and far beyond it. Midway through the first year, the case changed not because a body was found, but because documents did. Court orders unsealed search warrant affidavits, police summaries, and personal writings that had been held back while the earliest searches ran. The public finally saw, in black and white, what investigators had been weighing in private, a young mother who had documented fear before she vanished, and a home file that read less like a sudden walkout and more like a risk she had tried to name. The first set was personal. In a handwritten note dated before December 2009, Susan Cox Powell recorded that she feared harm and wanted her wishes known if anything happened to her. Friends and church contacts had already told detectives about strain in the marriage. Now there was a record, calm and specific, that matched those conversations. Alongside there were emails and statements collected early in the inquiry, references to arguments, financial pressure, and a plan to safeguard assets for the children. None of these papers proved a crime. Together, they fixed a state of mind and gave context to the missing person clock that started on December 6th. The second set was procedural. Affidavits outlined what officers noted in the house and what lab screens confirmed. They described the 2 fans, the damp couch, and small biological traces that matched the missing adult, without overstating what those traces meant. The affidavits also listed items seized, devices examined, and the methods used to build a timeline around the late-night hours in question. If you read these filings the way detectives do, you don't look for speeches, you look for how many points in the story required outside verification and whether those points survived that verification. Here, too many anchors were missing when they should have been present: receipts, footage, phone activity supportive of a long family outing in a storm. The third piece was the investigative posture itself. In press briefings tied to the release, West Valley City Police made clear what they believed by that stage, that Susan was the victim of a homicide, and that the spouse was the primary person of interest. They also acknowledged a working theory that disposal could have involved help after the fact. Even with that, the department held the same line it still holds today: no charges were filed, and the case remained officially unsolved without a body. That duality is difficult for families and the public, but it is the legal reality in nobody cases that lack a singular, conclusive piece. The effect of the releases was immediate. Tips rose again, search volunteers re-engaged, and the narrative moved from maybe she left to find where she went. The documents also reframed how people understood the quiet details from the early chapters: the phone in the van, the wallet left behind, the altered routines. They were no longer isolated curiosities, they were aligned with a paper trail that had warned of danger. For investigators, this was the mid-case turn. It didn't produce an arrest. It produced clarity about the direction of travel. There is a caution here that matters for every cold case audience. Personal writings and affidavits can tempt storytellers into overreach. This case doesn't need embellishment. The value is in the plain language, what the missing woman put down while she was alive and what the official filings say about the hours when she disappeared. For the families who live with uncertainty, clarity is a kind of respect. For an investigation with no body, clarity is also leverage. It keeps the search honest and the memory accurate. By the end of this chapter, the file had more weight. The public knew what fear had been recorded, what the scene actually showed, and where investigators' focus had settled. The legal status did not change, but the story did. From this point on, any fair telling has to reckon with the documents, because they are the part of Susan's voice that survived. By the middle stretch of this case, the focus shifted from maps to safety. Separate criminal conduct by the boy's grandfather, Stephen Powell, had already pushed child welfare decisions toward stricter oversight. That context matters because it explains why visitation with their father in Washington state happened under supervision and on a tight clock. The missing person investigation in Utah did not change course, it simply ran alongside court orders meant to protect two very young witnesses. On a supervised visit Sunday in February 2012, the boys were dropped at their father's home in Graham, Washington. A monitor walked them to the door. They ran inside. The door closed. Entry was blocked. Minutes later, the house was on fire. First responders arrived quickly, but there was no rescue to make. Both children were killed, and their father died by suicide. This event did not answer where Susan is. It did, however, confirm the risk profile investigators had documented for months and remove the only voices that might one day have clarified the hours of December 6, 2009. Back in West Valley City, the file hardened around what could be proven. Personal writings showed that Susan Cox Powell had recorded fear before she vanished. The residence remained the last confirmed location, with anomalies that never fit a voluntary departure. The midnight camping claim failed routine checks of weather, mileage, and common-sense logistics with toddlers. Financial and scheduling moves after the disappearance pointed away from a reunion and toward a future without her. No single page was a verdict. Together, the pages formed a consistent picture. The aftermath was administrative and necessary. In 2013, Utah authorities closed the active investigative phase while keeping the case open for credible leads. In 2019, a court declared Susan legally deceased, a step that settles paperwork but not questions. The official posture today is plain: no body recovered, no criminal charges filed in Utah, and the disappearance remains an open cold case. The investigative belief stated publicly, homicide suspected, the spouse long treated as the primary focus, never became a courtroom indictment. That is the reality of a no-body case when one decisive piece is missing. There is a human obligation in telling it this way. Families deserve accuracy, not drama. Communities deserve a path to help that doesn't fuel rumor. The enduring lessons are basic and hard: document warnings, report abrupt, illogical changes, keep records in a way that can be audited years later. In no-body investigations, ordinary details, receipts, routes, messages, routine deviations, carry the weight that physical evidence can't. When those details are preserved, the door stays open for the one lead that can move the line from belief to charge. If you followed this story from the first quiet room with two fans and a damp couch to a supervised visit that ended in tragedy, you know why clarity matters. We do not have remains. We do have a timeline that holds, a documented risk that predated the disappearance, and an investigative record that explains why the case is framed the way it is. That may feel unsatisfying. It is also honest, and honesty is what keeps a cold case ready for the day it isn't cold anymore. I've told this case with one promise: stay honest, stay human. If someone you know writes down fear, believe them, document it, report it, and keep the receipts. Ordinary details can save lives. We owe Susan and families like hers clear eyes and steady voices. What part of this story stayed with you, the timeline, the documents, or what followed? Tell me where you're watching from, or why it didn't work for you. If this moved you, please subscribe to see crime stories for the next case, and add your voice. If you're in danger, call 911.